In this Burnout Extra, I'm going to show you how to replace the steering knuckle on your 2000 Jeep Cherokee. And this process takes a while, so good luck. The first thing you're going to want to do is obviously take off the tire as well as the brake caliper. So I'm going to do that first. Now, once you have the tire off, there will be two bolts that hold in the caliper itself. So those come in from the back and they're right near these rubber bushings. So you're going to want to take those two bolts out next so that you can then get the caliper off. Now, this piece right here actually holds the pads in place with part of it, but this is the steering knuckle that we're going to be replacing. So this hub assembly, which is right here, this is actually a separate piece. So this needs to come off of the knuckle itself, and that is by 3 bolts from the back. These bolts will be a 12.13 millimeter socket, and they're easily strippable. So if yours has never been replaced like mine, it can be brutal. But like I said, from the back, there's 3 bolts that will take off this hub. It's about from here forward, and that will separate it from the knuckle itself. And once those 3 are out, then you'll be able to slide this off the front. Maybe you'll need a puller kit as well. It's able to pop out this ball joint here, so I can easily access that back bolt. When I say easily, I mean it's still gonna be a struggle, most likely. But hopefully not. After you've gotten the 3 bolts out of the hub itself from the back of the knuckle, now you're going to want to disconnect this front nut from the hub. So there should be a pin going through it. You can see it right here. And I'm going to straighten that pin out. Once you pull the pin out, there will be a little cover and then a lock washer that's kind of wavy looking. That you want to pull off and save as well. And then there's a big nut that you will need to impact off. This large nut is metric, however, I'm using a 1 7/16 socket. It should do the trick. There will be another washer tucked up in here inside the hub. Now at this point, you want to pull the hub off of the knuckle. What I have is a puller. You want to stick the 3 prongs of the puller on the outside and then make sure the puller is in the middle there. If you don't have these pullers, I'll put a link down in the description. That'll find you a set of these. This is just a cheap little set that's not too strong. Like, I wouldn't put an impact on this because it would probably ruin the puller. But regardless, they're good to have around. And for this application, it should work. You just don't want the hub to spin, so what I'm doing is holding it with my right hand in place and then spinning it with my left hand. Whacking it actually does help because it helps loosen up all of the rust and corrosion that's on there. So what I did was I tried to whack the knuckle, which is the part I'm replacing, because the hub ideally will be kept the same. Once this is fully loose, it should just slide right off. You'll see it pop off in just a second here. They do sell tools that will thread onto these bolts here, and then you could actually hit it with an impact, but I don't have that tool at the moment. So that puller set will do the trick. The hub will just slide right off of the axle. This axle goes into the 4-wheel drive front axle of the Jeep. So once again, this hub will just slide right off and this will be left dangling. You do want that loose for now, and then that's how you are able to pull off the knuckle afterwards. There's 2 more pins that need to be pulled out. So there's one down bottom here, and there's one underneath this bracket right inside here. So once again, those are 2 pins. They'll be a little smaller than this one, but you want to be able to pull those pins out, and then you can take those nuts off. So I'm going to try to pull the pins right now. Nice. Okay, at this point, once you have that pin out and that pin out, which took me forever, you can grab a socket, buzz off the bottom nut, and then that one you'll need a wrench setup, which I'll show you in a minute. What's easiest for this nut under here is getting a wrench, which I have a 7/8 on there, and then you want to turn the axle all the way to one side so you can get the leverage. After both of those nuts are finally off, you want to straighten out the axle, pull the axle out more, then this should drop down. Of course it won't, because it's so corroded. So we're gonna whack it. Well, that's how it's done, folks. This would be a good time to check your ball joints while the knuckle is out. So this ball joint should only go up and down. This one, you should be able to move all the way around. So, like I said, now's a good time to check those while you have everything off. Mine look good enough to the point where I don't want to change them. Okay, now that we've waited a couple days for parts to come in, I now have a new brake knuckle, or steering knuckle, whatever it's called. I have a new one. And I actually hit it with a light coat of paint because it was bare metal and I needed it to look better than the rest of the car. So yes, it just arrived. Like I said, this is where the brake pads ride. This is part of the steering and you have to attach it to a couple of the ball joints. So I'm going to show you how to install this right now. And the first part of it will be pulling out your drive shaft a little bit. And this is the four-wheel drive shaft here, as well as just the front axle. Don't look too close because you'll notice more broken parts. You want to pull it out of the front end so that you can get the new knuckle over the top of this and easily slide it onto the ball joints. So like I said, pull it out a little bit so that it's straight out. You should be able to slide this right over. Now make sure that wherever the rear of the car is where the brake pads ride. So once again, this is the driver's side. So this is the rear of the car and I'm making sure that these are on the correct side. And then from here, you want to essentially get this bottom one onto that ball joint down bottom and this top hole onto this ball joint while pushing in the axle back into place. You can now get a nut on here and a nut on the bottom of this one. And those are what they call castle nuts. It really looks just like a castle and it allows you to put a pin through it afterwards because you can see that there's a hole in those ball joint threads so that the nut doesn't back off. So what I'm gonna do just to hold it in place is get this bottom one on by hand. There is a bracket that holds the sensor that comes in. Remember, you can remember that we took it off of this right here. That's essentially for the ABS brake light system. So even though the bracket's a little beat up, I'm actually gonna throw it on anyways. And that goes on the bottom of this other one. Once you have these two nuts good to go, I would recommend buzzing this up with an impact. So I'm gonna grab an impact and make sure that's tight, and then grab a wrench and make sure that this one's tight as well because you won't be able to get an impact on this one here. You know what's crazy is that we don't have Jeep merch yet. So many Jeepers out there. And this is such a bad example of one. We don't have merchandise yet. But our merch is at burnoutshow.com/store. If you want to check it out. Okay, so the castle nuts, you want to tighten as tight as possible. However, you want to get it to a spot where you can see the hole directly through the castle nut because you want to be able to put a cotter pin straight through that nut. So, like I said, it should be as tight as you possibly can. However, you also want to make sure you'll be able to slide a cotter pin through. So if you have to loosen it a little bit or tighten it a little bit more, then as long as you can see the hole all the way through in order to put a cotter pin in, that's pretty key because these cotter pins will keep these nuts from backing out when you're steering left and right all the time. And so you don't want the nut to slip off and then all of a sudden your car quite literally falls apart. So next you're gonna put in 2 cotter pins in these 2 spots here. That's just to make sure you obviously don't forget them later, but once again, so that the nuts don't back out. It actually doesn't need to be any specific cotter pin, but I just recommend whatever's the biggest that will fit through, I would use that. I was able to slide the cotter pin through, and then from here, you just want to bend the end of the cotter pin so it doesn't back out. Next thing that you'll want to put in is the ABS sensor. Now, there are a few brackets holding that in a specific place, so you kind of want to follow along on those brackets. Now, the big hole on the knuckle is where the sensor actually rests in place, and the small hole with threads is where the bolt goes through the sensor and into those threads. And this should be a small little bolt that you pulled off before, and that goes directly to the sensor. So once again, you want to make sure that it's clipped into this bracket here that we previously installed. You want to make sure that that's correct. And you also might have to bend the bracket down a little to get it in the right place. You can see the wires are kind of held out of the way at the moment. And then once again, this little pin is going to go into that small hole from the back side. And then the big hole, this little square sits right inside there. So the sensor is essentially like this, and then you put the bolt through the hole on the other side. Now, if you're putting in a new hub, then this would be the perfect time to just grease this up and slap it in. What I'm actually going to do is put in the old hub because mine are actually not that bad and the bearings inside are really not terrible. So what I'm going to do is put some grease along this axle part right here. I'm just going to use some spray white lithium grease. It's pretty thin, but it will stick and essentially avoid corrosion. You don't need grease here, but it definitely will help. And then one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to buff this area right here along this hub. And that's because that's where it slides right into this new knuckle. And so I want that to be as smooth as possible and not corroded. Because I don't want it to be uneven when I'm tightening everything together. So like I said, I'm gonna buff this area here as well as grease this with some white lithium grease and slap that on now. This hub is actually held in by 3 bolts from the back. I got new bolts. These 3 bolts were the 12.13 millimeters that we pulled off before. And ultimately, those were the original bolts. They were completely junk. That was what I was sticking vice grips on because they were so stripped. So what I did is got new ones that aren't a 12-point bolt, and I'm going to slap these in, which is easy peasy from the back. This is my classic double wrench trick. It just gives you more leverage to tighten bolts. But you have to remember, you're stronger than a bolt. So if you over tighten, it will snap. So after those 3 bolts are in, now it's time to tighten this final nut here. And there's a few things that need to go on the end of this. One is this big washer that will slide on first. Second will be a funny looking washer that isn't perfectly straight. This is essentially a different type of lock washer, so that will go on next. Then of course, the nut that holds everything on, this will be a big strong nut. The big nut I just hit with an impact to make sure it was nice and tight. You don't want anything on this axle to be loose. And then from there, there's kind of a funny looking castle nut like we were talking about before. That slides over the top. Grab a cotter pin and slide it through the nut like this and ultimately bend that around. There you have it. This is how you change a steering and brake knuckle on a 2000 Jeep Cherokee, as well as install the hub again so that you're ready to put on the brakes and the tires. If you're curious to know how to change the brake pads and or swap out the caliper pins, then I will link those videos down in the description as well as put them in the upper corner of the screen. So once again, if you want to figure out how to change the brakes, be sure to check that out. But that's going to be all for changing the knuckle in your 2000 Cherokee. Obviously for the passenger side, it will be a very similar process. And the only thing you need to do from here is attach the steering rod that goes up in this side, and then you put a castle nut on the top, which we've already done in the other 2 places. So you can just follow along those instructions for that. But like I said, that's gonna be all for this video. Thank you for watching. You'll see a ton of videos on the channel about this Jeep, but if you wanna know more, then go to burnoutshow.com/fleet. You will see a blog of all of our cars where we give you more information about what parts and what work was actually done to the different vehicles that we own, ride, and work on. So once again, hopefully this helped. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.